welcome to Generals of World War II, The Art of Command. We are super excited today to have a new guest, Dr. Grant Harward from the U.S. Army Center of Military History. Hello, Grant. Today's topic, we actually have two generals we're going to talk about on the Axis side. We're going to talk about General von Manstein from the German Army and General Dumitrescu.
Dumitrescu, yeah.
Of the Romanian Army. But before we get to that, Grant's going to read a brief disclaimer for us.
Just a disclaimer saying that these are my own views and do not represent those of the U.S. Army, the Defense Department, or the U.S. government.
Yeah, now Grant actually has a book out. It's called Romania's Holy War, which you can find on Amazon. And what's that book about, Grant?
Basically, I'm trying to look into and dispel some myths about the Romanian Army, which is usually just described as, a bunch of simple peasants who didn't know what they were fighting for. They end up in Stalingrad, and they really weren't that motivated. Instead, I want to argue that they're highly motivated of Hitler's allies, and they actually also participated in the Holocaust to a large extent. And a lot of what their ideology was dovetailed with the German ideology. So it's kind of looking at the motivation. It looks at ideology, but also doesn't forget, discipline, remuneration, self-interest, other things as well, which we'll kind of mention some of these things about discipline, I think, here.
Okay. Yeah, we'll dive into the Romanian Army in just a bit. We're going to start off with von Manstein. He was born November 24th, 1887 in Berlin into a Prussian military family. Originally named Fritz Erich von Lewinsky, he was adopted by his uncle, General George von Manstein, and took the Manstein name. What was his early life like?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So I guess he was the 10th child in his family, but then his mother's sister, she and her husband, the Mansteins, didn't have any children. So evidently, I guess it was a relatively common thing to kind of, if one part of your family didn't have children, you kind of gave them over for adoption. But on either side, he came from like a blue blood. I mean, both aristocratic Prussian families with hundreds of years of military service and tradition behind him. That means you have a very unusual childhood where you are steeped in tradition, and it's basically assumed that you're going to be, especially in his case where he's been adopted to be the son, of a general, right? That the military is going to be your career. So he kind of had a delicate constitution a little bit. He was a Lutheran, so some Lutheran Puritanism in there. He's very correct and reserved. He's described as not being quite like the stereotypical Prussian, very acerbic Prussian commander, a more thoughtful one. But we'll see. But that kind of his life there, kind of developed there. And he, at 8 years old, he goes to the Strasbourg Lycée. At 13, he's in the Cadet Corps in Berlin, right? And part of the Page Corps in the court of the Emperor William II. So this is a very privileged young man going into the infantry arm in the military from a very young age.
Okay. But nothing, other than kind of his family to predict that he'll be one of the best generals in the German army yet.
Mm-hmm.
He's, as you mentioned, he's educated in elite Prussian military academies, preparing for a career in the Imperial German Army. What kind of a student was he?
It seems that he was intelligent and quick to learn a new subject, but at the same time, he doesn't have like outstanding scores or anything. And there's some indication that, when he put his mind to it, he could raise up scores, but he wasn't, first of the class everywhere, that kind of person. But when he applied himself, he usually did well. Interestingly, World War I kind of interrupts. He was finishing off his General Staff School education, so he actually never finishes that. So he later becomes known as one of the best staff officers out there, but he actually never finishes that proper education because of the war.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as you mentioned, World War I comes up, and he serves primarily as a staff officer, although he's wounded and is promoted. Where were his early military postings?
So he was in a guard regiment. It's pretty interesting. In the first year of the war, he served on the Western Front, I think in the Battle of the Marne, but then he's shifted out to the Eastern Front. He takes part in the Masurian Lakes and Tannenberg on the Eastern Front. So he's somebody who sees both sides, but also at this early point of maneuver warfare, and sees fighting against the French and the Russians. He's wounded in Poland, gets bullets in the shoulder and sciatic nerve, recovers, and goes back into service in spring 1915. But from there on, he's acting as a staff officer for army groups, armies, divisions in Poland and Serbia. He goes to Verdun, the Somme. Then he goes back to the Eastern Front in the Baltic states, and then goes back to France, and he's there in the end as part of the offensives in an attempt to try to knock the Allies out in the last year that failed. So he has extensive experience during the war on staffs.
Well, and it sounds like the front lines as well. If he's getting wounded, so he must have gotten a good dose of both staff officer and front lines. Okay. Yeah, he remains in the small interwar German army, the Reichswehr, gaining a reputation as a brilliant planner. What is he doing during the interwar years? I understand he gets married around this time.
So he gets married to Jutta Sibyl von Losch in 1920. They have 3 children over the next 9 years, a daughter followed by 2 sons. He's kind of a reluctant defender of the new Weimar Republic in the immediate post-war period. He sees it as something that's better than the threatened chaos of revolution. During the interwar period, he mostly serves again on divisional and corps staffs, but he has a couple of brief spells finally as like a company and a battalion commander. Yet his combat command wouldn't have to wait until World War II. So he's pushing through a lot of, getting a lot of experience during that period. Once the new Nazi regime comes in, he has a few interesting decisions that he makes. When in 1934, there's a new racial laws that include expelling soldiers deemed to be of mixed Jewish background being thrown out. He's possibly the only one to protest this, not out of a sense of sympathy for Jews, but because there was a junior officer who he respected that was a quarter Jewish and was being thrown out of the army. And he thought it was important for his honor to respect him and to show loyalty to this soldier who suddenly was being cast as a Jew. But in his response, in this petition, he made sure to say, I'm not against the Nazi Party, I'm not against racial ideology, but we maybe can make an exception here. It's not clear what happens there, but it is interesting. He also, in 1935, he gets involved in a project to try to restore mobility to the infantry. He suggests the idea of an armored assault gun. And this is something that's going to be the Sturmgeschütz in the Second World War, these kind of tank-like armored vehicles that are meant to be able to bring up firepower and kind of travel with the infantry. So this idea kind of comes out of some of his staff work in the mid-30s. But as we get towards the war, he is not among the peace party that Halder and others are looking at during the Munich crisis, but he's actually a bit of a warmonger. He's one that's looking towards Germany reasserting itself on the national and international stage.
Yeah, and that was my next question, because I can't tell if he's just a militaristic guy or if he was really supporting Hitler. In April 1939, he delivered a speech at the celebration of Hitler's 50th birthday in which he praised Hitler as a leader sent by God to save Germany. He warned, quote, the hostile world, end quote, that if it kept erecting ramparts around Germany to block the way of the German people towards their future, then he would be quite happy to see the world plunged into another world war. So is he just catering to Hitler, or does he really believe this?
I think in general it's what he believes. Maybe he's going a little over the top for, the leader's birthday party. But at the same time, when you look at somebody that is coming from this military aristocratic Prussian background, who was very opposed to revolution, didn't like the small army of the Weimar period, the humiliation that they saw, that they perceived from Versailles. I think, with his religious beliefs, it's easy for a lot of people to see that here's the right leader at the right time. That's the view at this point. So, yeah, it's interesting. I was kind of reviewing Benoît Lemai's biography of Manstein before this. It was interesting in his first chapter. It starts off, how emphasizing how Manstein ever stayed loyal to Hitler to the end. He shuns military conspiracy, and so it's interesting that I thought that was an interesting way to start off, like before getting into his youth, kind of reminding readers, like, this is somebody who sticks with Hitler through thick and thin to the very end. And then after Hitler's gone, he's there to, defend the Wehrmacht and its reputation.
Yeah. Once World War II begins, he played a key role in developing Germany's 1940 invasion plan of France, later called the Manstein Plan or the Sickelschnitt, the sickle cut. Can you briefly summarize this plan for us?
Yeah, I mean, basically, the idea is to not repeat the Schlieffen plan, rather than kind of attacking with most of the German armies wait on the right, going through the Low Countries and pushing down south towards Paris to try to capture that big juicy national capital that you think will knock out the enemy, whether it's through capturing their logistical hub or wrecking their morale. What he says, we don't want to do that. That's what's being expected. Let's shift down our forces to the left. We'll have this kind of Matador's Cape of just enough people going into the lowlands, and then we'll burst out further south. And instead of turning south, you're just going to drive west and try to capture as many of the Allied forces up in the lowlands as possible. And then once you've kind of decapitated, by encircling and decapitating the best of the Allied armies in the lowlands, then you can kind of turn at your leisure to go take out France. So it's more of a destroy the enemy army rather than capture the enemy capital type thing.
Yeah, they don't want to get bogged down in trench warfare. They want mechanized units going fast and going straight for Paris.
And that's the thing. It's like also taking advantage of those new mechanized units. Manstein, even though he's an infantry guy, he's very up to date. And so he's, kind of pushing the envelope. Doesn't make him very popular. And he actually doesn't get to take a big role in this because of that, because the higher leadership, are kind of forced on this. Hitler is looking for some kind of other option, and he grabs onto this plan. And so Manstein and Hitler have some good face time. It's, but in the end, Manstein only gets like an infantry corps to command during this.
Yeah, the strategy overall, though, led to the rapid defeat of France during the Battle of France. So how did the Germans complete the victory in such a quick fashion?
I think a very large part of a lot of people, it's like the better command and control, I think, is a big part of this. The one thing that Germany could produce a lot of was radios, and they thought to put them in all their tanks and have them in all their aircraft, have really good coordination there. I think also more recent combat experience, we kind of jumped over it, but there was, the invasion of Poland. So they're able to spend some time in Poland to, hammer out some of the details here. And then there's just a lot of luck. I mean, in the Blitzkrieg Legend by Karl-Heinz Frieser, which is an incredible read. I mean, he just shows how close run of a thing this was. If there was a few more French units, that were of a higher level of training in a few more different places, this whole thing might have gone sideways. And just everything seemed to line up the Germans' way. And I think a lot of that is that command and control, that combat experience, but also just luck and all that.
Well, in the avoidance of the Maginot Line and kind of the obsolescence of it. And I think that kind of hurt the morale of the French army. And I think they were just shocked how quick it went.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely true as well. I mean, there's definitely something about that, about the, what is the status of the French army and its morale. I mean, the Maginot Line has its role to play, but it's negated by this strategic insight that Manstein puts in there, and these new weapon systems that are being used in a new way, where the French are still kind of, the tank is an infantry support weapon. Very different attitude towards mobile warfare.
Well, moving forward in World War II, for Operation Barbarossa, von Manstein's commanding the German 11th Army during the invasion of the Soviet Union. How vital was the surprise element, and why were Soviet units overwhelmed so quickly?
Right, so he starts with a Panzer Corps in June, and he's with Army Group North. He actually gets shifted down to German 11th Army in September. But in that time period, I mean, he's benefiting from the same reason for the success of the German army at large. The Soviets, I mean, there's a few things here. I think there's a lot of flaws in the Red Army. Rapid expansion. My dissertation advisor, Roger Rees, I mean, he wrote his book, Why Stalin Soldiers Fought. One of the things that he said when his earlier book, but he was opening up and looking at the, I think this is for Stalin's reluctant soldiers, but he opened up kind of the League of Nations yearbook This is this publication the League of Nations put out every year that gave a summary of every army and its capabilities. And so he just opened the same page from a few different years in the 30s, looking at the Red Army. He just saw every 2 years, it was doubled. His insight was, you just can't do this. You can't double, triple, quadruple the size of an army and have that not impact, the quality of that army. And so that kind of led down how his views and his research into the Red Army, where he sees a lot of its flaws is just it grew way too fast, way too quickly. This is exacerbated because of the society that really doesn't have a professional middle class. I mean, before World War I, and then you have the revolution that really is against that kind of middle class. So there's a lack of voluntarism, especially among the officer corps. People are getting dragooned. I mean, the Soviet regime is not very voluntaristic in a lot of ways. And so you have these poorly educated guys getting told you're going to be an officer, rather than in the German army or the American army, where you're getting men who want to be officers to go train and do that.
That's a great point. In the 1930s, Stalin purged a lot of his experienced officers. So what's left is, as you mentioned, kind of just inexperienced guys taking over.
I mean, the purges are important, although a lot of these guys do come back. But I think it's there's fewer of them shot than I think the popular attitude is. There's the popular belief. A lot of them actually get brought back, but you do still have the impact of the fact that makes everyone less willing to take the initiative. So you have a lot of people, so even the soldiers, even the officers who are kind of better, who are more motivated, they're going to be less willing to take risks or take because of this system that is kind of wants control over everything. The Red Army's in the middle of rearmament. It's moved from its borders in 1939 up to these new borders after it's annexed the Baltic states and parts of Romania. So it's all these kinds of things put together. And then you have Stalin's refusal to believe an attack is coming, meaning the Red Army can't take proper dispositions. They can't call up the soldiers, put them on the line, get them in the right places, instead you have to be a pretty ballsy commander to do that when Stalin's saying we're not having a battle coming.
That's a great point, because you do something too aggressive or too outside of your parameters or orders, you'll end up in Siberia or in prison or shot, like you said. So yeah, you have to be kind of careful as an officer at this time in Soviet Union.
I guess, and lastly, the German advantages, right? Again, they have recent experience. They're really fine tuning their combined arms. Their society it's one of the most professional societies. You have so many people that have so many skills, and this there's an allure to the military. I think despite the fact that you have army of conscription that pulls a lot of people in, the officers are still far more based on voluntarism, and they're just overall this kind of attitude that's very, kind of willing to go fight. This kind of seen as a German thing to do, almost as the German national profession is to fight wars. So Manstein, he takes over the 11th Army actually because down in Army Group South, because the commander of the 11th Army, Eugen von Schubert, is killed. He's coming back from flying in his little reconnaissance vehicle, and he lands in a field that happened to have mines. And so the Soviets had mined it at some point. He lands in it, blows up, kills him. So they need a new army commander. And this is where Manstein comes in. German 11th Army is a really interesting unit because it's got a huge remit to do. It's got to drive east. It's got to cover a lot of territory in southern Ukraine. It's also supposed to drive south and grab Crimea. And it also is incorporated within it a allied force, the Romanian Third Army. So he's got to have a kind of inter-allied or inter-axis force that's got to cover a huge amount of terrain and do two different missions, which is drive east as fast as possible, but also go south and take this very heavily defended, difficult geographic position of the Crimean Peninsula.
Yeah, and Manstein adds to his laurels. He captures the strategic Crimean port of Sevastopol after a prolonged siege in 1942. How did he accomplish this?
I mean, it's pretty incredible. I mean, there's the initial conquest, he's this real focus on infantry, and he has to do a lot of this with just an infantry army, does not have very many panzers. And in fact, his mobile reserve is actually mostly Romanian. He has a few Romanian motorized cavalry units, and then he throws together a few German recon, motorized and armored recon units, and creates this ad hoc half German, half Romanian brigade. but he has to break through in Perekop to drive into Crimea. He uses, once he's broken through with the infantry at this very narrow neck at Perekop, which he's able to then release his German Romanian force to drive down to Sevastopol. And this is in October of 41. And there's this attempt to take Sevastopol off the march. And it fails because the Soviets have they've built all these fortifications. The city and the port is protected by these massive fortifications, which they can just turn around. They have these giant, basically naval guns that are on land that they can use to turn around and fire towards the enemy. It's further delayed because the Soviets during Christmas are able to land reinforcements. But it's really interesting. He gets very close before that happens to almost taking the city. It drags on. The Soviets land in the eastern part of Crimea during Christmas. Using these German and Romanian troops, he's able to hold that off. He's got to have, he actually has to fight a major battle in the spring in the Kerch Peninsula, where he's able to finally get some some panzer units. He's able to entice the Soviets further north, and he drives in the south with these German panzer units and able to destroy like 3 Soviet armies compared to like this motley crew that he's been able to assemble. Then he turns back to Sevastopol and just brings in lots and lots of artillery. I mean, he brings in all kinds of guns. The Romanians have given them their best kind of heavy weapons. They bring in some of these old Austro-Hungarian, like, super mortars and rail guns, and then once he gets to the north of Sevastopol, it's separated by a bay. Once he gets to that northern shore, he does a quick lightning crossing by boats that basically just ends the Soviet resistance by bringing in German troops right in the rear, and the whole thing collapses. And it's an incredible feat, but still takes months and months and months and tons of firepower to eventually level this, and coordination of using not just German but Romanian troops.
Yeah, we'll come back to the Romanian troops here in just a bit. Von Manstein is promoted to Field Marshal in 1942, becoming one of Germany's most respected commanders. He has a great quote about the idea of retreating. Quote, "Retreat may be masterly, but victory is in the opposite direction," end quote. Why do you think he was such a talented general, and did his troops like him?
I think the first question, I mean, he's smart. He has a strategic view and an operational ability. I mean, part of that, I think, also is he's so steeped in the Prussian tradition. He knows what the right solutions would be, but he also has that ability to think through the problem and find the right solutions and change things up. And with the Romanians, for example, like before they get into Crimea, he breaks up the Romanian Third Army and he puts them on the wings. He put like a German corps in the middle. He put the Romanians on the wings and have, where usually there'd be a river or like the Sea of Azov kind of protecting those flanks. When he gets into Sevastopol, he switches. You realize he's like, the wings are going to be where I need to use the best troops. And he puts the Germans on the wings and then puts the Romanians in the middle and has them like kind of push forward. He's able to very deftly like know how to use the right people, know kind of how to adjust things. And it's pretty amazing because he's an infantry guy, but he kind of masters artillery. He's using panzers. I mean, it's a pretty incredible toolkit that he has, that he's able to kind of shift from these different jobs and understanding how to use these different things.
Yeah, he sounds like a problem solver. And I guess his troops would like him if he's winning all the time.
And I think that's kind of the main thing, right? We're talking about the troops like him. I mean, later during the Battle of Stalingrad, when, the troops in there are encircled, when they hear that Manstein's coming, there's this kind of idea of der Manstein kommt, like Manstein is coming, and it raises people's morale. So I think if you're winning, you're probably liking him. I mean, if you are some of his soldiers, you probably don't like them. And Sevastopol was a really nasty, gritty, disgusting battle. It took a lot of infantry losses to overcome it. So maybe Fritz, on the front line in Sevastopol, maybe didn't appreciate Manstein too much. But in general, once you win, you probably like your commander a fair amount.
Yeah, 1941-42, things are going good, but things start to go bad at Stalingrad. As you mentioned, General Paulus's, I believe, 6th Army is surrounded. Von Manstein's leading the relief attempt, Operation Winter Storm, which ultimately fails. How close did he get through the Soviet lines to Stalingrad, and why didn't General Paulus attempt to break out to him?
I think in actual distance, it's only like 30, 35 miles. But in the realities of war, he might as well have been on the moon. The amount of like Soviet reserves in front of him was bad enough. What he had to attack with, I mean, Manstein, he creates this, he's given Army Group Dawn, but it's basically the remnants of the shattered Romanian and German forces, plus a few panzer divisions that have been expedited out there. So he's got a couple panzer divisions that are relying on basically kind of almost like regimental size remnants of Romanian infantry divisions and some cavalry brigades. And I mean, as much as the Romanians are still in the fight here, which people don't realize, I mean, they do a lot of help in doing kind of flank security and helping the Manstein's panzers go forward, but there's just not enough of them. They don't have the Romanians don't have enough. The Germans don't have enough fuel, ammunition. And then, even more importantly, like I'm talking about the ones right in front and what he's attacking with, the Soviet strategic reserves. They're able to launch Operation Little Saturn. That's really what forces Manstein to call off his attack. It's not the fact that he maybe couldn't get a few more miles closer to Stalingrad. It's the fact that after Operation Uranus, that had encircled German Sixth Army, a month before, now they're having Operation Little Saturn, which smashes the Italian Army, Eighth Army, farther north on the Don, which means Manstein has to redirect troops that way to keep that from collapsing. And so it's that strategic depth that the Soviets have that really mean that no matter how close he got, it wasn't good enough.
And Paulus is just, I guess he's combat ineffective, or just doesn't have the resources to get those 30 miles to break through that.
Yeah, I mean, even before the Soviet, this is really forgotten that there is a logistical crisis striking German Sixth Army and Army Group B in general. I mean, they're constantly fighting over who has to supply the Romanians on the flanks. The German Sixth Army says, "Okay, Army Group B, you do it." And Army Group B is like, "No, that comes out of your supplies." And so the Romanians are getting starved on the flanks, which is one of the reasons why they're going to collapse. But then German Sixth Army it's also doesn't have enough, and so they're sending horses out for winter quarters. Before this happens, so they're already demobilizing themselves because you have insufficient logistics, meaning you have less fuel and replacement parts for your vehicles. You're sending away your horses, then you get encircled, right? And then you start eating your horses. You use up what fuel you have, and so really, by the time we're looking at, maybe you could have broken out right at the very beginning, and even then, that would be really risky because they already had sent away a lot of their horses. They already were low on fuel. Then later, when Manstein shows up, a month and a half later, it's like you're even in a worse position. And then you'd have to basically abandon all your heavy equipment, heavy guns, and weaponry, and you're trying to retreat through the steppe. You'd have to run across 30 kilometers of frozen bare steppe with no defenses, and you leave behind your heavy weapons. I mean, that's not really attractive. So, I mean, the personality of Paulus plays a role in there. A lot of people criticized him, but I think there's a lot more. It was the reality of the logistics and lack of motorization, lack of even horses to be able to move. And you'd be condemning your army to almost like destruction out on the steppe rather than, fighting it out even longer in the city.
The Stalingrad disaster kind of stymies the German advance, and the initiative kind of briefly passes over to the Soviet army. However, Manstein conducted a successful counteroffensive at the Third Battle of Kharkov, briefly stabilizing the Eastern Front. And I've read that this maneuver saved the German army. How big was this victory?
I mean, it was really important, but although I think perhaps it's less about the maneuver than his efforts in the weeks before, with help from the OKH, dealing with Hitler and extricating German forces from the Caucasus and especially panzer formations, and then enabled to have him the reserves to organize the counterattack. So it's all that kind of chaotic period in February, March after Stalingrad, getting as many German soldiers. Hitler actually makes them leave behind some forces in this Caucasus, a so-called Kuban bridgehead. But he gets most of the panzers out, which means once the Soviets start kind of culminating, overrunning their logistics. So in some ways, by that point, it's almost inevitable that they would have been stopped. I kind of find it difficult to believe that the Soviets could have knocked the Germans out completely. A different German commander might have been able to maybe pull off a battle like this, but it maybe took Manstein to extricate these forces so deftly from the Caucasus, then also fight this battle. Kind of Rob Citino in his book about the German army during World War II kind of points out that, Manstein is, he's part of this long military tradition. This sort of maneuver is like straight out of the German-Prussian playbook, where we're looking at Hindenburg and at Tannenberg or earlier. I mean, so it's another general might have seen the same opportunity and done the same thing, but maybe not as well as Manstein. And like I said, maybe it was Manstein dealing with all that insane chaos of getting the troops out and having support from OKH and dealing with Hitler to convince him, okay, get these guys out. Because if that hadn't happened, you wouldn't have had the forces. Then maybe the Soviets could have kept driving forward.
That's a good point. But around this time, he starts to frequently clash with Adolf Hitler over strategy, and he's dismissed from command in 1941. And I read that he replied to his removal by Hitler saying, quote, "Please believe me when I say I will use all strategic means at my disposal to defend the soil in which my son lies buried," end quote. What happened to his son?
So this is his oldest son, Juro. He was killed actually in October 1942, action with the 18th Motorized Infantry Division up with Army Group North in the Baltic region. And this was a week after his Manstein's favorite aide had also been killed. So he kind of had these major losses, very close, colleague, and then his son, all at the time when he was when he was then being reassigned to go save the German Sixth Army. So that relief attempt is, in the weeks after finding out that his son had been killed and losing his favorite aide.
It's a tough time for him.
I mean, he actually didn't clash that too. I mean, this is the start of these clashes with Hitler. I mean, before he kind of had a good relationship with him, going back to that discussion about Sichelcut in 1940, and I think he's fired in March 1944, and Hitler tells him that at that time that the time of quote grand style operations end quote was over. So Hitler is looking for generals who are kind of more Nazi. I mean, Manstein was Nazi enough, but he wasn't like a pure ideological kind of soldier. He's looking for more Nazi soldiers. He's looking for generals who are willing to hold out, generals who are less independent, less willing to question him anything. I mean, people like Ferdinand Schoner, who became known as a hangman up with Army Group North because he was so brutal towards his men, willing to hang them for alleged cowardice in the face of the enemy. These are the kind of men that run the Wehrmacht and the Eastern Front for the last war once you remove people like Manstein.
Yeah, just kind of strange to me. I just did an episode on Battle of the Bulge, and you have people like Sepp Dietrich and Piper fighting that battle, yet you have von Manstein on the bench, who might have been a better fit. After World War II, he's tried by the British for war crimes, convicted, and served several years in prison before advising West Germany's military development. What were his later years like?
Well, I mean, he's able to re-enter society fairly well. There's a sense of the victor's justice, which means that, for a lot of Germans, he's not seen as a real war criminal. And then he makes it his life's mission to defend the Wehrmacht's reputation. He very effectively, even his memoirs, lost victories, right? This kind of idea of, well, we should have won. It's almost this kind of lost cause narrative that kind of blaming stuff on Hitler, not the generals who were advising him. He writes his memoirs, Lost Victory, but also other ones addressing his earlier life, extremely influential, not just in Germany, but they get translated and become hugely influential in historiography in the Anglophone world. He becomes an advisor on the creation of the Bundeswehr. I mean, this is a person that has a fairly satisfactory, nice, and fulfilled post-war life after about 4 years in prison.
Yeah, he dies in 1973. What do you think his legacy is, and how involved in the Holocaust do you think he was?
So, the legacy, like I said, his major role probably was turning the war into something different in 1940. I mean, if that had gone a different way, the entire war would be different. I mean, if that had turned into trench warfare, if the Allies had been able to scrape out a win or something, completely different war. So I think that plan and his role in pushing it was really important. And then he kept the Wehrmacht hanging as long as possible on the Eastern Front. And then longer term, once after the war, he whitewashes the reality of the Wehrmacht fighting on the Eastern Front, its role in the War of Annihilation and in the Holocaust. It's important to point out, so like I've said, that German 11th Army is kind of special. I mean, it starts out as part of Army Group Antonescu with this fourth forgotten army group that people are at the start of Operation Barbarossa. It was composed of German 11th Army and then the Romanian 3rd and 4th Armies. But it gets assigned an Einsatzgruppe Day. So this is an SS unit that's going to be tasked with murdering the enemies or perceived enemies of the Nazis, and number one would be Jews. And, I visited some of these areas like Nikolaev where I had locals point out all right, here's the German 11th Army headquarters, the Romanian 3rd Army headquarters across the road, and Einsatzgruppe Day was right there, right next to them. You basically have a German army with an army group-sized Einsatzgruppe attached to it. That's everywhere it's going in this. Like I said, it had this big remit of clearing southern Ukraine and Crimea. Einsatzgruppe D is going everywhere, and the Wehrmacht is helping. Manstein is issuing orders about the dangers of Jewish Bolshevism. His troops are supporting the SS and rounding up Romanian troops as well are doing this in Crimea, helping round up Jews. And there's massive massacres across southern Ukraine and into Crimea. And he's not just aware of it, he's part of it. And that all gets kind of swept on the rug, but until after his death, really.
Controversial legacy for sure. Let's talk about Dumitrescu now. He was born February 18th, 1882 in Dobrodor, Romania. What was his upbringing like?
Now, we can basically the exact opposite. I mean, we just had Manstein, who's a blue, even Von in his name, right? Dumitrescu is from a small village, very modest means. His family was better off with one of the nicer houses in this village, and they had to have had some more money because he was able to pay the horse tax to get into the artillery. There was this kind of added cost for cavalry and artillery units to join them, where it's to kind of keep them more socially elite and to a certain extent. So he comes from this very modest family, but is able to use, whereas Manstein would see the German army as his birthright. Dumitrescu would see the Romanian army as like a stepping stone, a way to socially advance, not something that is his by right. And he's able to use it that way pretty successfully in his life to go from a small, modest village to becoming one of the most respected generals of the Romanian army.
Yeah. Entered military service and graduated from Romania's artillery and war schools and rose steadily through the ranks in the early 20th century Romanian army. What were his first military assignments?
So he's a little bit older than Manstein, so he's actually able to get some command experience before he's a section and a battery commander in artillery regiments. He takes part in the Second Balkan War of 1913, although Romania's role in that was mostly an unopposed advance into Bulgaria, where the main enemy was cholera, rather than enemy soldiers, because the Bulgarian army was basically fighting Turks and Serbs. But still, he's able to actually have some command experience before the First World War.
Okay. Yeah, he continued his career in the interwar period, becoming known as a capable and disciplined officer, promoted to general, and given significant command responsibilities by the late 1930s. So what are his interwar years like?
So during the war, he becomes an operations guy. He's on the operations staff of the Romanian Second Army, which is commanded by General Alexandru Avarescu, who becomes one of the main heroes, lionized for his role. He leaves the army, retires in 1918 in order to enter politics. So this is somebody who's Dumitrescu is associated with. He has reflected glory, right? That he was part of this important staff during the war. And so during the interwar period, he's able to continue to climb the ladder. He goes in, becomes an operations officer on the general staff. He gets some more commands, an artillery regiment and artillery brigade commands. He gets an assignment as an attaché to France and Belgium. This is kind of important kind of rounding experience that you're going to see a lot of the key generals get. And then eventually division and corps commands, even becomes deputy chief of staff and inspector general of the artillery. So this is a guy who just keeps climbing the ladder during the interwar period. By the time the war breaks out, and Romania begins general mobilization in a defensive way during the phony war, they're kind of still neutral. But in 1940, he gets an army command. He's in charge of the First Army initially. Um, so yeah, it's interesting. Although as this time in 1940, you have various political things happen, and Romania abandons neutrality and then joins the Axis. And it's interesting that we have the German evaluations of a lot of the generals. And so as they're kind of going through the list, I found this in the official German history of the war that came out. Um, they actually evaluate Dumitrescu as one of the bad Romanian generals. So they don't really have much respect for him. There wasn't a lot of detail. I'd have to go dig in here, but for the Germans, they thought he was overrated. They didn't think that he really measured up compared to some of the other Romanian generals.
And you always wonder, well, why did Romania side with the Germans? And even Mussolini was kind of waiting to see how the German invasion of France went before he sidled up with. I mean, they were friendly, but he didn't fully commit to Hitler until he saw, oh, well, they're winning. Maybe we should join with them. So maybe that's what Romania was thinking as well.
Yeah, I mean, the fall of France has a huge impact on European geopolitics. I mean, that really convinces a lot of people, and most importantly, convinces the new dictator, General Ion Antonescu, that the Germans, they're basically going to win this thing. Moreover, as part of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, there had been a secret protocol that had signed away part of Romania, Bessarabia, this eastern portion of Romania. So after the fall of France, it's a few days after the French capitulate that the Soviets then sent an ultimatum to the Romanians saying, give us Bessarabia and northern Bukovina, which the Germans hadn't been expecting. So the Soviets demand that territory. The Germans basically tell the Romanians, you're on your own. You got to give it over. And that's what leads to Antonescu. He's able to take power from the king at that point. So he kind of quickly makes an agreement with the Germans, because then it's like, hey, if I get in the Germans' camp, they'll make sure that the Soviets don't take any more territory. There's that, the fall of France, the fall of that major power, the Soviet threat, and with the fact that Romania had become a military dictatorship. I mean, all those things kind of made Romania alliance with Nazi Germany make a lot of sense to most Romanians.
Sure. So when Operation Barbarossa comes up, I'm sure they're like, yeah, we're in. We want to protect our provinces. Dumitrescu commands the Romanian Third Army during this operation, and he participates in major campaigns in Ukraine, southern Russia, alongside German forces. Seems like they performed well at first.
Yeah, Dumitrescu, he gets transferred a few months beforehand to the Romanian Third Army. Part of this is the Romanian First Army becomes a reserve force, so he gets pushed up. So he's respected enough that they want him in charge. And Third Army is important because it actually has the best Romanian troops. It's got the Mountain Corps and the Cavalry Corps. They don't charge. These aren't guys with sabers. I mean, they do have sabers, but they're basically trained as dragoons. But the cavalry units, they're well trained, maneuverable. They've got motorized regiments. The Mountain Corps, these are mixed mountain brigades, so they're actually a little bit bigger. They're almost division sized, and they're trained to fight kind of individually, kind of more of a combined arms. So he has the best troops, which are then subordinated to German 11th Army before the invasion, and they're basically attached to them, knowing they are going to push into southern Ukraine, and assuming as far as like the Bug River. Dumitrescu is mostly given a flank support role. So there's a lot of advancing with short, sharp battles. So, kind of this initial invasion period, he's doing his job well, but in part it's because the Soviets are taking a beating by the Germans, and he's able to do a lot of mop up and protecting stuff. I mean, and at times the Germans are able to kind of levy him for his motorized units. And like I was talking about, that brigade that Manstein uses, that comes from Dumitrescu's units.
Yeah, it seems like he was mopping up quite well. He plays a role in advance toward the Caucasus during the 1942 German offensive. And I read that his army marched 1,700 kilometers, fought in 4 major battles and 42 minor skirmishes. And his army also inflicted 75,000 Russian casualties versus only 10,000 of his own. So do you think he was a good general, or you just had good troops working under him?
He has good troops. I think he's pretty competent, and the fact that he's given these missions that the Germans know that they can do is helpful. They're not being given kind of major cities to take or anything like that is a part of this as well. He's extremely aggressive. He works very well with the Germans. He actually is very critical of Romanian generals who aren't. Dumitrescu, he's interesting. He's also a strict disciplinarian. I think one thing important between these two advances we talked about, whether in Barbarossa from June to about October of 41, after that period, before July of 42, his headquarters becomes administrative headquarters. He basically turns over control of the Romanian Mountain Corps and Cavalry Corps to Manstein. They basically get assigned to German 11th Army, and Manstein gets to play with them how he wants. And Dumitrescu is actually given a job of being in charge of kind of administrative control of all Romanian soldiers east of the Dniester River. So he has to deal with working with the civilian government. And then he's also working with the Germans because you have little Romanian garrisons across southern Ukraine. He's got to try to make sure that the troops in Crimea are getting supplied and everything. So he has this interesting role of kind of switching back and forth of being an operations general, and then he stops and he becomes an administrative general. Then for the Caucasus, he becomes an operations general. But there's signs that he maybe is too demanding, that he expects too much. We're talking about going into the Caucasus. The Romanian Cavalry Corps is given a mission of clearing the coastline. And he actually thinks that the local commander, Rakovica, is not doing a good enough job. He's taken too long after crossing the Kuban River. And so he sends his chief of staff, General Arbore, to take over the Cavalry Corps during the fight. And in one case, he pushes, and they actually come up against one port where the Soviets decide not to evacuate immediately, put up a fight, and the Romanians take a fair amount of casualties. So there's a lot of kind of back and forth later after Rakovica saying, I wasn't taking too long. I was doing as fast as I could. You had Dumitrescu was breathing down my neck, sends in his chief of staff to lead in the attack, and which doesn't go off well, right? And it's happened a few times. So Dumitrescu is willing to fire people. He pushes really hard. He's very pro-German. He's critical of anyone who's blaming the Germans for not providing enough help. He's like, these are our allies. We need to provide them every bit of help. So he's a really difficult personality. And then in that administrative role, it includes discipline. And he is somebody, the Romanian army reintroduces flogging on the Eastern Front. And I can't tell you how many orders I have from him where he's just ordering a guy to be flogged 25 times, or deserters, just flog him and send him back to the front. There's this whole kind of process that, if a soldier's found as a deserter, he's supposed to go through court-martial, and Dumitrescu's attitude is just like, oh, you got some deserters, just give him 25 lashings, send him back to the front. He's very old school in the discipline department.
All right. Well, I won't ask you if he was popular with the troops. I can take a wild guess on that. And we kind of talked about the Stalingrad situation with von Manstein. So just briefly, the Germans were trying to mop up downtown Stalingrad, but on the outskirts was the Romanian army, the Italian army. So what happened there?
Yeah, so like we talked about Dumitrescu going down the Caucasus, because that's where Army Group A, right, supposed to be pushing. That was supposed to be the main, push. And then all of a sudden Hitler decides, and his generals say, let's go to Stalingrad, Army Group B. So then Dumitrescu gets sent up there, and in addition with a bunch of forces, and he leaves behind the Cavalry Corps, the Mountain Corps. Those stays in the south, even Crimea and the Caucasus. Dumitrescu and his headquarters move up west of Stalingrad along the Don River, and he gets these new formations that are being remobilized. These were troops that fought on Odessa under the Romanian Fourth Army in 1941. They'd taken heavy losses, had not actually been able to take the city until the Soviets withdrew. So you have a kind of a combination of veterans of that battle who haven't had the best experience. Some of them now are kind of more experienced and know how to fight, but they fought a nasty battle, and now they're being remobilized, and they have a bunch of kind of fresh recruits. So Dumitrescu, who's used to commanding these elite mountain and cavalry troops, all of a sudden has these kind of run-of-the-mill infantry guys, and they're not just and some of them are actually, they're not even the kind of the best, because he'd been using some of these other infantry units or divisions in Crimea in the Caucasus that had a bit more training and experience, and he's getting these guys who've been remobilized, And so he is very skeptical of him. He keeps accusing him of not having like enough heart. He's like, battere de inima, I mean, like beating heart. He's convinced that the Soviets are like overmatching them, which is kind of true, but he's also like saying, oh, we have too many deserters. We have always missing. And he has some of his corps commanders actually write back and say, well, actually, you're just getting like the preliminary reports. And we have a bunch of guys marked missing who then within a few days we figure out, oh, they're dead or they're with another unit. Like they're not actually running away. It's just that we're fighting these small battles, kind of company, battalion size battles. And, you're just not cutting us any slack.
Yeah.
But so he knows that like there are these Soviet bridgeheads on the Don. The Germans know. They put the Romanians in there, and the Germans and the Italians couldn't eliminate them. And Dumitrescu says, hey, let's get rid of these. And the Germans say, we don't have the tanks, the men to help you do that. And so Dumitrescu, when Operation Uranus comes, he kind of knows that he's in a bad position. And, the Romanians are kind of constantly sounding the alarm. And Dumitrescu is doing his best, but they're getting shafted on the supplies, like I described earlier. The Germans are not kind of paying attention to them, assuming that they're just kind of, hysterical, that like every week they're like, oh, here comes the big offensive, and then it doesn't come.
But then it came.
But then eventually came, and the Romanians fight the best they can, but Dumitrescu quickly loses control just because the forces get bashed apart. You have these huge holes. The Lascaux group fights as 3 or 4 days to try to encircle. You have a small encirclement on the Don that almost no one talks about, but it's this mini encirclement where the Romanians hold on as long as they can. But then Dumitrescu, he's unlike a lot of Romanian generals. The Germans are criticizing. They have one German commander wants to, I think, court-martial an entire corps, Romanian corps headquarters, but they never touch Dumitrescu because Dumitrescu they know is on side, and he gets the remnants, puts them on the Chir River, and he says authorizes the most severe measures, and that could be up to execution of soldiers, or flogging. He's like, do everything you got to get this line put up so that we have a line of resistance. If we didn't have Dumitrescu there, putting in that iron discipline, that's what allowed the Germans a chance to have Manstein come out and even attempt. Because if you didn't have Dumitrescu, half his army gets eaten up and bashed apart. He takes what's left and forms a line and does everything he can for the Germans.
Yeah, eventually the Soviets inflict 109,000 Romanian casualties, and Dumitrescu's remnant force limps back towards Bucharest. Despite the disaster, he was still regarded as one of Romania's more competent wartime commanders, correct?
Yeah, I mean, at the time, it's really interesting. Within days, I found this communication from the chief of this general staff, the Romanian general staff, Șteflea, to Dumitrescu, and he says very upfront, we aren't blaming you. This is not your fault. You guys were overmatched. Germans didn't really listen, but the German forces are, Germany is just too strong. This is a temporary setback. We're going to be okay. And really interestingly, because I didn't find a lot of marginalia, but in this case, Dumitrescu wrote on this report saying this is also my Christian belief. I will communicate it to the men, which he then does. Kind of tells his soldiers yeah, we've taken a beating, not our fault. We did our best. We're going to hold on here, and the Germans are going to come through for us, and so it's really not, that doesn't happen. But I mean, it's probably not until Kursk. I mean, I think really when Dumitrescu starts losing heart. Yeah. There's a time where it's they think that there's going to be the research because the year before, right, there was a big Soviet winter counteroffensive. Things looked pretty nasty, and then Manstein came in Crimea and performed this miracle at Kerch, right? So there was this hope that this was going to happen again at Stalingrad. That doesn't happen the next month, and then by the summer when you have Kursk, that's when the Romanian generals start realizing, okay, the game's up, and at this point again, Dumitrescu is more in an administrative role. He's again responsible for all troops, Romanian troops. He's not really doing operational stuff up until March of '44, which is when he's given an operational control over a portion of the front defending Romania.
Yeah, Romania switches sides in 1944, and he's sidelined and later investigated by the new regime there. Was he put on trial for war crimes?
Yeah, he was in 1946, but they were dropped, allegedly due to lack of evidence. Although important to point out that in 1946, when he's being investigated, you don't have a communist government. It's this transition government. So a lot of the people, a lot of the prosecutors were rather sympathetic. Dumitrescu, he wasn't at any of the major kind of infamous Holocaust events, the Yash pogrom, the Odessa massacre. He wasn't involved in those. He was elsewhere with the Romanian Third Army. I mean, he was plenty guilty of, I mean, I found orders of, whether you're talking about like command responsibility, like his corps commanders are talking about burning down villages and shooting hostages. They're taking Jews as hostages, specifically taking Jews as hostages to shoot. I mean, if he's willing to order, severe measures against his own men, what he does for partisans, and he will definitely believes wherever there's a Jew, there's a partisan, but he's kind of not directly attached to some of these really notorious big massacres. And so he gets off. He's because at that time they're not willing to kind of punish everybody. They're not wanting to do that. Then by the time like the communists take over and they start a new round, I mean, we have examples of people who were let off in 46, 47, and then they get re-prosecuted but under the communists later on in in the 50s and get locked away. He conveniently dies before any of this happens.
Yeah. Dies in 1950, largely out of the public eye during the early communist period in Romania. What do you think his legacy is?
His legacy is, it's one of also of having done everything he could to make sure Romania did everything it could to help the Germans win this war, regardless of what that alliance meant, right? That you were allying with the Nazis. He also was involved in actual war crimes and against Jews and also Soviet civilians, non-Jewish. And then he also kind of has it's a bit different, but because when he starts in this run up to the investigation for war crimes, he knows that they're gunning for him. So he writes a short account called like Considerations on the Fight on the Don Bend. It's something like that. And it's this self-serving, he basically saying, I'm so great. We won all these battles. Then the Germans wouldn't listen to us. And the Germans are all to blame for Stalingrad. I did everything I could. He then even says, like, at one point, he's like, Antonescu never blamed me. The dictator, he didn't blame me when we lost Stalingrad. So why should I be blamed now? Because one of things he could be taken for trial for was being like leading the nation to disaster. It wasn't just war crimes against Jews or kind of these. It was this he could be Antonescu's man who helped take the country to disaster, and he was like, oh no, but he has the balls to say like Antonescu didn't hold me responsible for Stalingrad, so why should you? Why should I be held responsible for it now? And then he even goes so far as to claim that like the army was part of the resistance against the Germans because they actually didn't really want to be fighting along. The Germans were really to blame for why the war went bad. And the thing that's really incredible is that this gets published early on. It gets kind of suppressed during communism, but after communism falls, it comes back, and it's now been republished in like military magazines. It's been republished in collected volumes like over and over and over and over. Like I have like 2 or 3 books with like accounts of Stalingrad written by different generals, and his is like in every single one. It's been published as a standalone booklet, and it's like this self-serving version of events is kind of still how Romanians look at it, where it's Manstein's lost victories. People look at it and think, all right, it's biased. We finally figured out after 50, 60 years that maybe we shouldn't take him at face value. Dumitrescu's little pamphlet, that is accepted as like the gospel truth by a lot of Romanians to this day.
Right. Yeah. And if you'd like to learn more, please check out Grant's book, Romania's Holy War, which you can find on Amazon. And Grant, this is fantastic. I learned a lot about Manstein and Dumitrescu, and we loved having you on the show, my friend.
Well, thanks for inviting me. And maybe we'll find some other Romanian to profile someday.
Ready when you are. Thank you, Grant.